Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Among the many issues contending for a place on the international agenda, there's a very strong argument for giving primacy to international health issues. Disease knows no boundaries and is no respecter of class or ethnicity. And to an enormous degree, the underlying contributors to world health problems embrace other global concerns like poverty, inequality, and human rights. No affliction better demonstrates this than the AIDS epidemic, which still assaults the world. This scourge affects nearly 70 million people worldwide. Yet there is hope. Real progress has been made through effective medical and administrative steps over the past 25 years. So this is a good point to discuss what must be accomplished in the next quarter century. My guest is Dr. Peter Piot, Executive Director of the United Nations AIDS Program and Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. Dr. Piot, welcome to Dialogue.
Good to be here.
It's good to have you here. And in point of fact, I think one of the great achievements of the last 12 years that you have led the UN AIDS program has been just that, putting it on the international agenda by attracting the attention of politicians and perhaps largely by making them aware it's an economic issue and a security issue as well. What's your sense of how successful you've been in that? And let me be very precise with that. It may be on the agenda, but does it have the same kind of attention as, let's say, global warming or something? Are you fully satisfied that they have gotten the message?
Well, certainly, George, there's an enormous difference today in terms of political commitment in the fight against AIDS and when we started with UNAIDS. When I started with UNAIDS, I had three goals. One was put AIDS on the political agenda and redefining it as a development issue, security issue, which it is. Two, it was to develop and build a broad coalition. This is not only AIDS activists, AIDS doctors, but politicians, religious leaders, scholars, people from unions, what have you. And thirdly, mobilize the money. And what is the most concrete expression of political commitment in is the money, is the budget.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And that you can count. And it's not the number of speeches that a president gives on AIDS or on any other issue, as a matter of fact. And in '96, when we started with UNAIDS, about $250 million was spent on AIDS in the developing world. This year we estimate that's about $10 billion, so a 40-fold increase. And that is directly a result of this political commitment. But there are many competing issues, and climate change is also an extremely important one. And that's also the league that AIDS belongs to. It's not one of many infectious disease problems, because the world has many, but because of its very exceptional nature, because it kills people in their most productive years of life.
Right.
It has an impact that we see for no other health problem. And in 25 years, AIDS has become the fourth cause of death.
Right, exactly.
It's undermining development and so on. So I think that it could definitely be better, and I'm concerned that it is sustained, that we have changes in leadership in US Congress. You're electing a new president next year. France, Germany, UK, Nigeria all have new presidents or prime ministers. The previous ones were very committed to this, so we have to make sure that the new leadership is as well.
That's a very helpful answer, because it strikes me that you're saying several things. One is there has been a lot of progress, measured even by the money and by the cooperation.
Yes.
And that's very hopeful, but we need to keep that momentum going.
Right.
And I suppose sustainability of this effort is now the major challenge, to make sure that people don't relax.
Absolutely, and from many perspectives, we're starting to see results, also return on the investment. We're really at a turning point in the response to AIDS, and for the first time in its history, we see results on a wide scale. About 2.5 million people are on antiretroviral therapy today. These are 2.5 million people whose lives have been saved by this. Exactly. And that comes from about 100,000 5-6 years ago. Huge
That's
difference.
enormous. I mean,
enormous.
Just, as a layman, that's
it's enormous.
Yeah.
And we see also in quite a few countries in East Africa, in Cambodia, in southern India, in the Caribbean, where there's a decline in new infections. So these are lives saved 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah.
So there's real progress, but now, we should not become complacent, that's for sure. There's still 8,500 people who become infected every single day, and 5,500 people who die every day because of AIDS.
We must not forget this.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. I think everyone watching can appreciate those facts and figures. If you don't mind, Dr. Piot, I wanted to turn a little personal with you, because I know this has been not just a job, it's been your life, certainly since the early 80s, the last 25 years.
That's right.
Here's the question. I don't really know how to phrase this very well. I'm a layperson. You would quickly grasp that I'm not a scientist at all. And it's this: how does one conceptualize this disease? The reason I ask that is, how do you you yourself, mentally imagine it or think of it? Let me personalize it. I think of it as almost something malevolent. It almost has an evil aspect to it. And it's also kind of a disease for our time, in the sense that it seems to me it's significant that it comes together with globalization. It's an aspect of globalization.
Yes.
To me, it's also significant that sexual transmission of any sort is one of its main methods of transmission. I mean, that's the most intimate of human.
Yes.
And the most private. I mean, but I can go no further. How do you, as a doctor and as an activist, look at it?
Well, my concept, my feeling of AIDS has changed over time. In the early days, and I've been working on this since full-time, basically since 1983, because I'd been working in Africa before.
Right.
I was then working in Belgium, and we were seeing Africans with something that looked like AIDS described in America, but big differences. We didn't think it was gay men only. In addition, we had quite a few women. And in my early days, it was more looking at it from a medical scientific curiosity. But also, I started losing some friends in Belgium because of AIDS, gay friends. And so that brought it then also close to home. And now I look at it as something, as one of the most fascinating expressions of our humanity. On the one hand, you think of it in a quarter of a century, about 60 million people have become infected with HIV. They're all related with each other.
Yeah.
It gives a new concept of blood relatives, because either had sex with each other, got a blood transfusion from somebody who has it, or your mother had it, shared needles. There are no other ways of transmission. And it tells a story also of the globalization of risk, of the networks that exist in the world.
That's right.
And that we don't see necessarily. It's a touchstone for many of our beliefs, because it's a disease that has a terrible stigma. Stigma is in our head, but that stigma is not so much about AIDS, but it's about race, a lot of racism, about sexuality, our own sexuality, or that somebody else we don't feel comfortable with, and so on, about how men and women relate to each other. And in addition, from a medical perspective, it's really a very malevolent virus, because it's a virus that actually attacks those cells in our body that are supposed to defend us.
That's right.
So it really is a Trojan horse strategy.
Yeah.
And what the virus HIV does to the human body, AIDS does to society, because it undermines the resilience of society. It kills people in their most productive age. It often kills the most entrepreneurial among us.
This is true.
Who are
This is
also
true.
sexual
Yeah,
entrepreneurs
yeah,
sometimes.
Yeah. If I may say so, sir, that's a magnificent answer. I don't generally comment on answers, but I think so. Quite frankly, it is, because my shorthand for this is a condition of the human family. This is all of our concern. And one of the things you said in the course of it is to get rid of and you point to your head, get rid of the stigmas we attach to people. And that, I think you might agree, would make this a human rights issue as well, right?
Absolutely.
To bring
yes.
Bring that into it.
AIDS, at the end of the day, it's a very political disease, and it's a human rights issue.
Right.
Why do we have such an AIDS epidemic? Because it's thriving on inequality, on rights violations. The late Jonathan Mann, who was the first director of the WHO AIDS program in the 80s, and with whom I worked in Kinshasa, He always says AIDS thrives on human rights violations. And it's not so much a disease of poverty, just of that bit of inequality. Look at Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's, oh my God.
One out of 20 people
This is true.
in D.C. are HIV positive. That is higher than many West African countries. And I was at Howard University on Tuesday, and we had a conversation about this. And it's really a perfect storm that we see with lack of access to services because of poverty, marginalization, gender inequality, violence against women, gender-based violence, lack of opportunities. And you bring that together, you've got AIDS, and that's why Africa is the most affected continent.
But I like your point. Africa is, I think, the figure I heard some time ago was 70% of the cases, at least at that time, might have been in Africa.
Yes, indeed, it's still the case.
But I like the way we're sitting in our nation's capital, the United States, and you're right, absolutely right. 1 in 20 people here are affected with this.
Yeah.
That's stunning. And maybe that's why, as I told you earlier, I've been reading your speeches a lot. And when you spoke in Germany in March of this year, the spring of this year.
Ah, yes, with Chancellor Merkel, yes.
Chancellor Merkel, and I think you commended the European Union for their contributions, but also said much more would be needed. But you also said something very interesting. In the same speech, you and I've got the words here, you warned them against widespread complacency. What did you mean by that? What was the complacency part of the problem?
Yeah, what we've seen in Europe, but also in the US, and particularly since the introduction of treatment, a breakthrough. This was in '96, that AIDS is a treatable disease, not curable, but treatable. There's been a growing perception that it's done, it's over, and if I get it, I can take a few pills and that's it. AIDS has largely disappeared from the media. There has not been this heterosexual epidemic among at least the white population, but AIDS is the first cause of death of young African American women.
That's right.
And in Europe we see the same thing. And the result is that we're seeing an increase in new infections, particularly among men who have sex with men, but also marginalized populations, migrants and so on. And I'm afraid that we may see similar situations and phenomena in developing countries now that treatment is being introduced. So the job will never be finished. And if only because every day young people become sexually active as part of growing up, normal, totally normal. And so we need to make sure that none of them becomes HIV positive.
And to add to that complexity, how will it be affected? Because I'm mindful you made those remarks in Germany, of course. I get the impression also borders of concern, so to speak, are expanding. Let's say Eastern Europe, Russia, these places are going to be, and maybe already are, equally problematic.
Right. The fastest expansion of the AIDS epidemic is in the former Soviet republics. Russia alone has already over 1 million people living with HIV out of a population of, 120, 130 million people, and has a demographic crisis. Russia loses every year 600,000 to 700,000 people. And you take AIDS in addition to that, with affecting the young population. It's a pretty young group that's infected. It's driven by injecting drug use with heroin coming from Afghanistan, by prostitution, but now there's more and more transmission through sex society. So that's a big, big concern. Ukraine, over 1% of the adult population is HIV positive.
Would say that again?
Ukraine, over 1.5%.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, to relate those figures to what we talked about earlier, you're talking about people, politicians understanding in many countries the importance of this. Is that true now in Eastern Europe and Russia? Do the leaders know? Do they understand the figures you've just cited? Or is that still to be accomplished?
There's progress, but it's not always there. Ukraine was the first country in Eastern Europe to recognize it. Already, former President Kushma, he had declared, I think it's 2000 maybe, or 2001, the year of HIV prevention. Ukraine is every year a year of something. And that was then, so that was a first signal. During the G8 conference summit in St. Petersburg last year, President Putin made some strong statements and increased the AIDS budget. But the response is still very, very uneven, insufficient. There's a huge homophobic culture that makes it very difficult to do certain things. Also because injecting drug users are a main affected group, but the law does not allow treatment of drug addiction with heroin by methadone and so on, or exchange of clean needles and syringes, which can save lives. So we still have a long way to go there.
That is very, very helpful. In the Bremen speech again, and also in speeches you've given right here at the Woodrow Wilson Center twice, I appreciated the way that you put things in what I might call a wider context. I mean, we're talking about a disease you've already defined as exceptional, one that you earlier said, and I think this was very eloquent, it really is part of the human story that affects all of us as a family, a human family. But to treat it and understand it, we have to have a broader focus on things like human rights we've mentioned, on prevention services, trans-regional cooperation and so forth. Can you speak more about the broader context of attacking this disease?
Well, if we approach AIDS only as a medical problem, we're doomed to fail. We need doctors and nurses, the medical system, to treat people with HIV. That's for sure. But once you get into prevention of the condition, it's about communication, education, community mobilization. We have the stigma we have to deal with. And then when you look at the consequences, we have 14 to 15 million orphans in the world because they lost their parents because of AIDS. Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, because in countries in Africa, heterosexual transmission is the main mode of transmission. Large families. So for every adult who dies from AIDS, there are children who are left behind. It's not only the most productive age group, but also the most reproducing age group. We have legal aspects, discrimination in the workplace. People lose their job because of being HIV positive. Women are beaten up when they reveal to their husband that they're HIV positive, even if it's the husband he may have given it, etc. We see a decline in economic growth and agricultural production. With several percentage. It has an impact on societies as a whole. I'm talking now about the most affected countries in Africa. And so for me, it belongs in the league of big development problems of our time. And we really don't see that with any other disease, because other diseases affect young children or infants or older people. I mean, that's very important for the individual, but on a societal level and for the economy, that's a very different picture we see with AIDS.
There's nothing quite like AIDS then,
right?
For that kind of effect.
So what we say in UNAIDS is that we need, in our jargon, a multi-sectoral approach. In other words, you need the medical people, the health people, but also education, sex education for children, the schools. You need it's in the workplace programs. You need to deal with the consequences, the orphans, and that is increasingly being done in particularly in Africa, I would say.
On that last sentence, that's increasingly being done, and I think you've outlined the way that the approach has to be multifaceted, to use a term. Does that mean, here I will quote something that, is an exact sentence you use. I'm thinking now the next 25 years.
Right.
And if I don't, I hope I didn't misquote you, but you'll tell me if I did. We have a chance to get ahead of the disease.
Right.
What does that mean? I mean, get ahead, obviously that's very good, but to what degree, what can be achieved? What kind of goal can we realistically see?
Right. Well, over the last few years, we really have the proof that this is a problem with a solution. That provided there's the political will and there is the money, that we can make a difference. This is where America's leadership has been so important with the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief that President Bush announced in his State of the Union in 2003.
Right.
And so more people on treatment, less being infected. Now, we have to now intensify that, and in all countries. And I think that the next few years we're going to see more and more results, provided that commitment remains. Political commitment that we discussed, but also the financial one.
Right.
And then we see also countries like India and China where the leadership, the top leadership, is now also has woken up to the threat of AIDS.
Excellent.
And that's I would say that that's been the major contribution of UNAIDS, has been to put it there where it belongs, at the top of the agenda. And now our top concern is making the money work for people on the ground, so that all this work, this money reaches the people and with actions. But we have to make sure that this is going to be resources for a longer term response. It's not going to be over.
It's not going to be over, but I can appreciate. I mean, I like the way I think anyone listening or watching can appreciate the way we can achieve progress against this disease. As you yourself know better than I do, that there's some major obstacles, obviously, to making this work, even with the money. For example, you mentioned that I think this is now the #4 killer in the world, isn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Disease?
Yes.
And it seems to me an increasing number of that concerns women.
Yes, indeed.
I mean, why does that happen? That's a bad trend right there.
It is. I mean, in '81, when the first report of AIDS came out, it was about 5 gay men in California.
That's right.
And it was, white, middle-class gay men. And some people still think that that's where the disease mostly is. But today, half of all people living with HIV in the world are women. In Africa, it's even close to 2/3. And it's going up in every single region in the world, in nearly every country, including in the United States, and particularly affecting the African American community.
Does that also mean mother-to-child transmission is a growing problem then?
Mother-to-child transmission. And the reason is a little bit biology, in the sense that transmission of the virus of HIV during intercourse from men to women is easier than from women to men. That's a bit, but the main reason is not biology, but is society, is the position of women, that women are not totally in control of their sexuality, that they're also, when you look at what we can do to prevent sexual transmission, is no sex, in other words, abstinence. That marriage was not made for abstinence. Being faithful, but that has to be on both sides. And or use a condom. And so all this, in these cases, women depend on, let's call it the cooperation of men, the goodwill of men. And
that certainly is
plus we have sexual violence. You know, there are countries, the Caribbean, Southern Africa, where 1/4 to 1/3 of all women, their first sexual experience is rape.
I know, I heard that,
And so it's not under control of women to do that.
You know something, as I listen to you, Dr. Piot, I keep thinking, you know, in my layman mind, that in a sense, AIDS is like a mirror of the pathologies of our society.
Yeah,
you know, all the bad things that we do to each other play out in this disease in one form or another.
Yeah, and it's a globalization of risk. But it also, I always say, AIDS brings out the worst and it brings out the best in people.
Talk about the best.
And the best, what I see, is that there are true heroes in terms of people living with HIV who, despite the stigma, despite the rejection in the community, will come out publicly and say, you know, I'm living with HIV. I don't want anybody to go through what I had to go through. And so they go and speak in schools and so on, and they're fighting for their rights, for access to treatment. And so we have the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, which I think is one of the prime civil society movements of our century, with Zaki Ahmed as a shining example. We see compassion, we see international solidarity. I mean, what the American people are contributing to the fight against AIDS, I think is also part of the best coming out of the best.
This again is the PEPFAR initiative?
The PEPFAR, yes, and other countries also, because that is not inspired too much about really national interest and so on. I mean, it's really sharing what we have with others. It is also all these men and women that I meet everywhere who are working in the trenches and for little money.
There's a fascinating story of you in Majengo in Kenya. You go back there, and I think there's a nun or a nurse who works at the grassroots level. She sounds like one of the people you're talking about.
Oh, that's Elizabeth Ngugi, my good friend. Yes, in the 80s, I was a professor at University of Nairobi for some time and doing research, but also working in the community. And that's the time when AIDS was coming up in
Right.
Kenya, which the government of the day really didn't like.
A lot of
And
governments denied it.
Yes, I was nearly expelled even from the country because I'd given an interview to the Guardian, British newspaper, and saying, you know, look, we're having a problem on our hands there because I saw how the sex workers were becoming infected. And this was, yeah, with Elizabeth Ngugi, and a nurse who's now professor of community medicine. And she organized the sex workers. We, you know, with teaching them how to use condoms and how to resist men, organize against violence, being beaten up in the community. Yeah, there are many, many heroes. Noreen Kaleba, who worked with us, she lost her husband in Uganda from AIDS. And with 12 men and women who were either infected themselves with HIV or had lost their partner AIDS, they made a self-support group, the AIDS Support Organization, TASO. That's now one of the, it's the mother of all AIDS service organizations in Africa, and they're reaching hundreds of thousands of people.
That's wonderful.
And so there are wonderful examples of how to say resilience of communities and people taking their destiny in their own hands. And that's what development is about. And I'm a strong believer that you can turn any kind of catastrophe into something positive, if only we learn from it.
I can't imagine a better point to say thank you for this conversation. I'm glad I asked the question.
Thank you.
And I assure you, you will not be expelled from this country for this interview. We'll have to have you come back here many, many times, Dr. Piot. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And particularly for helping us end on this positive note.
Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Dr. Piot, thank you personally.
Thank you very much.